Hey, good morning, India. Good afternoon, Europe, and good evening in California, and sleepy time in East Coast. Welcome you all. This is a MedBix webcast. My name is Ramana Namaraju, host dailywayformedicine.com. That's our website for the clothes. But anyway, for the swag for the pharmaceutical and medical device industry, so we created I have written a book. In that book, it's swag for the each chapter has a swag, different gifts for different swag things for different chapters. You could buy from Amazon and Etsy. At the end, I can give you, or you can go to my website www.dailywearformedicine.com. So my name is Ramana. So just let me before I play the recorded version of the Dr. Alexander's interview. I want to talk with you about um, yesterday a little bit. I had a very rough week, last 2 weeks. Um, Yesterday was a Father's Day. You know, my father, I lost him. He was a quintessential man, and he's a very brilliant man, and he guided me all his life. His curiosity is unbounded in my view. That actually all we are four brothers and two sisters. We all adopted um, his idea of curiosity. Is a curiosity was embedded within all of us. In fact, so my brother. Another thing is my brother passed away 2 weeks ago. It was a tough for all of us. He's like a father figure to me. So it's kind of a tragic event. Um, but um, I'm going to talk about a little bit different before I introduce the Dr. Alexander's video. Um, my I had a conversation with my son yesterday. His name is Ramesh. He's a musician. He's a neuroscience graduate. He's a good speaker. Uh, what he said was interesting. Uh, he said that why there is not a community in this country. What's the problem with all these divisions and everything? He said that um, America is not built on community. It is on economy. It's based on economy. Indians and Chinese and Russians and all those people have communities. They came from communities. It's a history, and they have a culture and history, a long time. So that community, we don't have it. Unfortunately, we live here. We have to build that community. You have to feel, not grab anything you like and then send anything back home. So we are living here. We have to build a community here. This is a sad part where I think America is going through a crisis in that direction, a communal crisis, a crisis of community, caring for each other and understanding just to grab money and send somewhere. I think we are living here. Since we are living here, we have to care for that. So he gave a very good opening lesson to me. Um, but anyway, let us talk about that consciousness. Dr. Alexander, I'm good. Before I introduce you, Dr. Alexander, uh, the the concept of consciousness engaged in physics and medicine in different ways. In physics, particularly, is the wave function collapse they call. So a particle, a light, so a light can behave both wave and particle. Is called a particle and wave duality. That means it behaves both wave and particle. But when you observe, when a conscious observer looks at it, it becomes a wave becomes a particle. It assumes a wave function becomes it assumes a one particular position, a fixed position, fixed particle. So I don't want to get into too much of a physics inside. I have a master's degree in physics, but I don't want to get into that. But what I'm saying is the duality of the light wave is light is both wave and a particle. But how does it collapse into a particle when you observe it, something? So when you observe something, why it collapses is a conscious observer. A consciousness has to exist. That is a physics explanation of the physics for the existence of consciousness. That is one of the physics concepts we give for the if somebody wants to explain consciousness in science, that's what it is. It's basically explaining the conscious observer role in the observer's role in that creates a consciousness. So in physics, that is one of the explanations. In medicine, there are several of them. One of them is cardiology side. If there was someone has a cardiac arrest and goes on CPR, if you do CPR and almost dies, people they can dissociate in after 3-4 hours or even one day after they're dead. It's like almost dead in a very sense. You can dissociate them. So when they come back, who is telling them he is the same person? There's no memory inside. Their brain is dead and everything is. How they come back? Actually, Dr. Alexander talks about it in his talk. He said it's not I have a probability that I can recover from I can come back, I can live, survive bacterial meningitis. That's what he got inflicted with. But it's recovering from that and then become a normal person is a miracle. That's what he said. So the same thing applies in the cardiology when somebody has a heart attack or episode. When they die for 4 hours, 5 hours, it's like a clinically dead in the sense. How when they come back, when you resuscitate them, when they come back, how do they know that they are the same person? Why not they are Margaret Thatcher or Princess of from Africa? So why don't they why don't they know their names? How do they know? These are mysteries. So some of the things is consciousness has to exist. That's one of the explanation of that in the medicine. In physics, quantum cosmology, there is another exist is the universe is in the cosmology. Universe has to be the entire energy of the universe has to be zero. The sum of all positive and negative energies together. If it is all zero sum game, then there is no recording. Either you record, I'm talking, you're listening. All of them has to be. There is nothing can record. So there is a recording is happening. You know that I'm talking. So to do that, actually, what they suggest that is a consciousness outside of the space time, outside of this universe, has to exist. Outside of the space time. So that is the role of consciousness in the quantum cosmology. So in the medicine, in the neurosciences, Dr. Eben Alexander is going to explain. Let me give you some background on Dr. Eben Alexander. He's a neurosurgeon he taught neurosurgery in Harvard Medical School for 15 years. He has done more than 4,000 operations he has done, on the neurosurgery and radio surgeries. Then he has several books he has written, authored in the peer-reviewed journals. 230 presentations he did worldwide on the neurology side, neuroscience side. So his credentials are impeccable credentials Dr. Alexander has. So what happened was he had a story he's going to explain to you, his life story, what happened to him. But he's coming from totally a man of science. Dr. Eben Alexander is a man of science. And he was giving you a great concept about the consciousness and reincarnation. In fact, he is going to talk about that. And I'll let you introduce. But Dr. Alexander, with I'm honored to have him. I recorded him. We did a live on Wednesday. Wednesday or Thursday I did. So it is a very great conversation you must listen to. It is eye-opening. It is mind-blowing in all that sense. We learned a lot, quite a bit from him. There is my co-host also joined, Rajita Pamakanti. She joined with us. She's going to ask a couple of questions. But without further delay, let me introduce Dr. Alexander's conversation.
The MedBricks webcast is focused on bringing distinguished Indians and others from diverse fields of science, medicine, technology, and philosophy to learn from each other and to create a new understandings and foster new ideas related to healthcare. Hello, welcome. This is MedBricks webcast, healthcare media channel. My name is Ramana Annamaraju, host of the webcast. Before introducing our distinguished guest, let me give you a story that is so relevant, his life story. There was a mathematician living in the southern part of India in the early 1900s. His name is Srinivasa Ramanujan. For a brief period of time, he put the mathematics on fire. He jotted the equations for black holes, string theory, and the viruses that we are facing today. He wrote these equations without any books of relevance on his hand. It amazed the Western scientists. How did he arrive these equations without any much help, without any books? He was a little hesitant to answer it. With the persistence, he said there was the local goddess Namagiri appeared in his dreams and gave the equations. That would have been the end of the story for anyone's career in the Western world. Some would have been dismissed, somebody's on moonshine or on smoking something. But in his case, think about it. Michio Kaku said that he's the strangest man in the field of mathematics. The theoretical physicist Freeman Dyson said that he's a man of mystery. So you can witness even the programmers from southern India. A lot of programmers come from the same part of that country. They can pray in the morning an idol or a snake or a cow, and go and write in the incredible code in the afternoon. The same logic applies for them. Logic and reason and the faith are not two different worlds. They are the two sides of the same coin. Western people, they think it is a two diametrically opposite ideas. So talking about gods and heavens, the present guest talks about heavens. Let me introduce you. His name is Dr. Eben Alexander. Welcome, Dr. Alexander. Thank you for joining us. Please give us a story led to this point in your life.
I think it's important to point out I'd grown up in a very scientific family. My father was the head of a neurosurgical training program. He was fascinated by physics, cosmology, all the big questions in science, but he was a very influential neurosurgeon. And he never had any doubt in the reality of a loving personal God and the power of prayer. He used it all the time in his healing work. And yet I grew up in the 60s and 70s, and like so many of that generation, I always knew that science was the pathway to truth. Just that I struggled through a lot of my formative years in science, especially the 15 years spent at Harvard Medical School, which is really my main kind of focus, in trying to understand how conscious awareness could survive the death of the brain and body. And to me, it seemed to be a very challenging and difficult question. I fully subscribed to what we'd been taught, materialist neuroscience, that's not necessarily very informed about quantum physics, although I realize now how important quantum physics is in understanding more deeply the mind-brain relationship. But that was really my kind of setup. And in that setting, that's when I went into coma and had my near-death experience back in November 2008. Was driven deep into coma over just a few hours with a severe bacterial meningoencephalitis that afflicted all lobes of my brain. There was really no place left for any kind of construction of any dream or hallucination. I mean, my brain was too damaged to have any such experience other than the most rudimentary such experience. And yet what I witnessed during this incredible week in coma was far richer, more detailed, alive, and meaningful in my life than anything I've ever been through. So how did that happen when my brain was demonstrably offline? And it's not just the story I tell in the book Proof of Heaven, but also in the medical case report written by 3 physicians who were not involved in my care, but were absolutely fascinated by my recovery, which had no precedent in the medical literature. And they really go even further than I did in terms of making this case that my brain was far too damaged to have any kind of dream or hallucination or confabulation. And also my survival. When you read the medical parameters of my case, it's clear why the doctors said that I started the week with a 10% chance of survival. I ended it with a 2% chance, but with no chance of recovery. Because that's really what those dire parameters of my medical condition portray. And yet I had this astonishing recovery. In fact, the peer-reviewed scientific editors of the Journal of Nervous and Mental Diseases challenged the authors of that case report. How do you explain it? And they said, well, it's because he had a near-death experience that he had this, what we call a miraculous healing. They might not use the word miraculous, but certainly they'd use the word unprecedented and, surprising recovery. And I think that's really the important part of the lesson for people. And you can learn a lot more at ebenalexander.com and the many books that I've written about it. I work with scientists around the world, and for example, the Scientific and Medical Network in England, also the Galileo Commission at galileocommission.org. And these are groups I've worked with for several years now in trying to come up with the kind of scientific explanation for how all this works. And there's a lot of progress being made. To think that, we're going to have to default to materialism because we can't explain this in some other bigger philosophical system is just plain old wrong. There's a tremendous amount of progress being made even now. And I think your audience can find evidence for a lot of that progress if you go to bigelowinstitute.org, because there was a contest had last year by Robert Bigelow, who's an aerospace entrepreneur out in Las Vegas here in the United States. And he put up prize money for people to answer the question, what's the best scientific evidence for survival of consciousness beyond permanent bodily death? And received 204 very powerful essays. They gave awards to 29 of those essays. They're available for free to the public right now, bigelowinstitute.org. You'll realize that the scientific question has already been settled. Yes, the afterlife and reincarnation have a tremendous basis in reality based on empirical study of human experience. No, we don't have perfect explanations yet, but there's a lot of work being done on bigger systems than materialism to explain the brain-mind connection and where all this is headed. And that's what I'm most excited about as a scientist. because religious systems have had, more than 5,000 years to teach us some of these very deep lessons about oneness and the healing power of love. And now it's all being fully supported by scientific investigation of things like near-death experiences and past life memories in children suggestive of reincarnation. And there's a wealth of information at bigelowinstitute.org just as a major starting point for anyone who's interested in this question of survival of consciousness beyond the death of the brain and body. And when you realize we can all access that through prayer and meditation, you realize this is not just about NDEs and what happens when we die, but much bigger questions about how to live our lives today in every moment, and how we view ourselves, how we deal with ourselves and others, and really how we choose to live. And the correct answer is kindness, forgiveness, mercy, acceptance, and a love for our fellow beings. That's the simplest answer, and it's been there for thousands of years. And the fact that it's now emerging from the science of consciousness, I think, will help this world finally get on the right page.
Dr. Alexander, what is a consciousness?
I like to keep it simple. Consciousness is awareness of existence. And what I would go so far as to say is what we call mind and our awareness of existence, that is, our conscious experience, that running stream of thoughts in our head, is actually a form of primordial consciousness. We are sharing one mind. It's what near-death experiencers and other seekers and mystics throughout thousands of years have encountered in their journeys, to the spiritual realm, to the, quote, other side, is a unified form of mind where we start to realize that we're all in this together. And of course, near-death experiences commonly, going back thousands of years, there's mention of a life review, of your life flashing before your eyes. And when we realize that that's not just some vague remembering of events of life, but actually a reliving in a very powerful form that allows us to engage and be transformed and to progress through this kind of reassessment of our lives. You realize that the life review is teaching us that the boundaries of self in many ways are a fiction. And so just as religious systems often harp on a golden rule, treat others as you would like to be treated, I would say that's a fundamental lesson that's coming out of the current study of near-death experiences and of the science of consciousness that really shows us much more of an integration that we have with others, and that we're sharing this kind of dream of the one mind. And we're here to learn and teach together in this process of growth and further understanding. But it comes to see the brain as a filter that allows in that primordial mind into this apparently kind of a partially disconnected state of having a self and a sense of a here and now. Of course, in the life review, you've gone well beyond a here and now to a realization that from the spiritual realm, there's something that I call deep time, a very different ordering of causality that doesn't necessitate the kind of paradoxes that you might think would occur if you thought that earthly time flow, as we experience it here in these material bodies, is some fundamental driver of causal experience in the universe. There's a bigger, broader perspective, this deep time, in which one can witness all the events of one's life and even of other lifetimes, simultaneously kind of contributing to this kind of understanding of one's soul journey. And I think as you start to understand that kind of perspective of what the NDE offers in terms of this much broader presentation of events of our lives in a form like a life review, where we are actually experiencing that as the emotional feeling that our actions and thoughts of that life review had at the time on others around us. So that's the interesting thing about the life review. It's not from point of view of self as much as from this kind of higher self that shows us why to hurt another is to hurt ourselves. And this is where I think the modern science of consciousness studies has a lot to say about this kind of moral and ethical interpretation of the human condition.
Dr. Alexander, in physics, we consider a consciousness causes the collapse of the wave function. A conscious observer makes that the wave function collapse. I wanted to ask you age-old question: is the mind and brain are two distinct, two different properties of the nature? They're two. What is the relationship between brain and
Well, they
mind. So
obviously are very highly correlated in what they're doing. We thought for decades in neuroscience that the brain created consciousness out of purely physical matter, and that's mainly because all we could study was physical matter. That was the stuff we could measure and quantify. Um, but it turns out that especially when you're trying to deal with these kinds of journeys, these spiritual journeys and deep meditative epiphanies and experiences, you start to realize that there's a bigger theater of operations that's really necessary to explain it all. And the material realm, the realm that physicists study so deeply, the physics and the mechanics of it, it turns out that's just not all there is. And not only that, you're skipping an observation that what we really experience is the inside of our own consciousness. We experience a mental universe. We don't experience that physical universe directly. And I think that's where so much confusion has come into the world of physics and trying to explain all this. And of course, as you know, it centers around the measurement paradox and the 16 or so different interpretations of the measurement paradox. But I would remind people of things like John Wheeler, who was the head of physics at Princeton, had a lot to do with the Manhattan Project, and a lot of quantum physics in the mid and late 20th century was due to his thinking. But he realized that you had to postulate something that he called the participatory anthropic principle, that had to do with the fact that there's something about the mind of the observer that seems to be deeply, deeply kind of entangled with what we uncover. And that mind is not local. The whole thing that disturbed Einstein so much was local realism was called into question in 1935 in the EPR paper. Local realism, the notion that all of physics is somehow local, that we have force-carrying particles that actually transmit information from one particle to another, but that none of it occurs independent of that kind of idea of locality. And then the notion of realism is the idea that the particles have the properties before they're observed. Now, you started this part of the discussion by talking about David Bohm, and of course, he had his own interpretation of the measurement paradox, but his, in many ways, was a kind of a hidden variable theory that has been disproven by the Bell, the John Bell paper of 1964, and then all the experiments from Alain Aspect in the early 80s, all the way through to the current era, that basically more and more paint us into a corner where we have to admit that mind exists fundamentally. I love how Richard Kahn Henry, in his beautiful one-page essay in the scientific journal Nature in 2005, he was in the physics department at Johns Hopkins, and he wrote a beautiful essay called Mental Universe in Nature, and go find it, Google it. It's widely available on the internet, but he makes it crystal clear that from his perspective, looking at quantum physics, that the universe is fundamentally mental and spiritual, as he put it, not physical. And I think that's where all of us have gone who are deeply into this question, unless you approach it from the very simplistic and superficial level of just thinking this is about explaining some material world and not explaining experience within that world. Because when you acknowledge that, just as John Wheeler pointed out in his participatory anthropic principle, he said, to be is to be observed. And in many ways, he said he agreed with the great Irish theologian, I think it was George Berkeley. I know Berkeley was the last name. That's who Berkeley, California was named after. But he was a theologian who lived 200 years earlier than John Wheeler. And yet Wheeler agreed with him that it's really all about perception, that nothing exists until it's perceived by the mind of an observer in the now. And I think that's where we really start to get more interesting about this. And we talked a lot about quantum physics and its relevance in our book, Living in a Mindful Universe, that was co-written with my life partner, Karen Newell, who is also the co-founder of Sacred Acoustics. And for those interested in meditation, I would strongly encourage using sacredacoustics.com, use headphones. You'll see what I mean if you start exploring that modality, just as we discuss in Living in a Mindful Universe. But really, we've come a long way, even just in the last few years, I would say, towards getting a much cleaner version. I love Bernardo Kastrup's contributions on the metaphysics. He is a supporter of our book, Living in a Mindful Universe. He endorsed that book because we come to the same conclusion of metaphysical idealism. That the mental layer of the universe is something we have access to. And it has tremendous potential for integration and assimilation of information and for our influence on the world at large. And this is where, for example, in our book, we talk a lot about placebo effect and spontaneous remission, people healing cancers, healing infections far beyond any kind of medical intervention, and then go all the way to miraculous healing and near-death experiences. Like in my case, like in Anita Morjani, whose stage 4 lymphoma vanished when she had an NDE and came back to this world, or Dr. Mary C. Neal, the orthopedic surgeon who had a over 30-minute warm water drowning in Chile, kayaking in the late 1990s, was brought to the surface dead. She was resuscitated, ended up having a full recovery. And anybody in medicine knows more than 30 minutes underwater in a warm water drowning, your brain doesn't come back from that. So these are healings that are really unprecedented in the medical literature. But I would say all they do is demonstrate the amazing potential that we all have as sentient beings by connecting to this kind of deeper layer of the universe, the spiritual layer, and acknowledge that healing power of love, kindness, mercy, compassion, forgiveness. These are all the qualities to live by. And the more we can do that, the more we can manifest this higher world of our dreams. And that certainly involves physical, mental, and emotional healing that I would say is all completely originating in spiritual healing. And there in the use of the word spiritual, although some people use religion to get to spiritual power, and that's fine if that works for you, but unfortunately religions also come with a lot of baggage and a lot of ideologies and a lot of scripture that in many ways can be conflicting. So I realized early on after my coma experience that the deep meditative traditions of all the great faiths lead us towards more of a notion of oneness and wholeness and healing that can be very practical and useful in this kind of discussion. And spirituality for me just has two ingredients. One is an acknowledgement that we're all kind of sharing that one mind, that we're all really in this experience together. And the other is that there's some meaning or purpose to it all. And again, we cover a lot of the details of how those expand into a whole worldview that can be very healing and wholesome for any and all of us in our book, Living in a Mindful Universe. People can learn a lot more about that at evanalexander.com. Well, I think when you look at near-death experiences and you then look at the hospice experience, so these are all people who go on to die. They have the very same experiences. They have loved ones who have left the physical plane who come to welcome them, escort them over, bring them comfort. They have the very same kinds of qualities that are described in deathbed visions and have been through the hospice and terminal care literature going back for centuries now. And I think that is really kind of the important thing is you realize that, and then there's this whole literature in addition on past life memories in children suggestive of a reincarnation. If you go to uvadops.org, that's the University of Virginia Division of Perceptual Studies website, you'll find these are academic research scientists who for more than 60 years have investigated more than 2,500 cases of past life memories in children, of whom 1,700 of the cases are what they call solved. That is, that they actually were able to identify the person that the child is describing. And of course, they do all kinds of things to make sure they're not being misled by fraud and people lying and making things up and people fooling themselves into thinking they have a reincarnation case when they don't. These scientists are extremely skeptical. Otherwise, they wouldn't still be doing this work. But they found 2,500 such cases, 1,700 solved, where the best explanation is of reincarnation. So obviously something, and again, important to point out, these children often manifest with phobias. They have birthmarks in about a third of cases. They have a birthmark corresponding to the lethal wound of the prior existence. And phobias, they can have nightmares that go on for months, all related to the previous lifetime. So it's not just vague contact with somebody else's life memories. They act as if they lived that life, but those memories disappear. as the scientists who study them will tell you, by age 5 or 6, if you haven't recovered those memories, they're going to get covered over. And as adults, we generally don't remember past life and between life memories, although they can be recovered in a near-death experience, in hypnotic regression, in therapeutic sessions. They can be recovered in dreams. There are many different ways that these past life experiences can come to us. But in other words, we need a much bigger theater of operations to explain all this. And this has been scientifically vetted to the point we know these effects are true. That's why the papers at that bigelowinstitute.org are so valuable, because responsible researchers have gone into great detail to investigate these cases and get to the facts of the matter. And the fact of the matter is that we seem to have lived past lives. And we have memories of these. Those memories generally get covered over before we hit adulthood. But there are many ways to get to these deeper truths. And when you realize that the entire world of transpersonal psychology, that say began with the work of Carl Jung in the mid-20th century, the famous Swiss psychiatrist who came up with notions of, say, synchronicities and these incredible linkages that didn't show any causality within the material world, but showed a tremendous amount of meaning and causality kind of in a soul sense, in a spiritual sense. And then the work that Stan Grof did originally with LSD, but then with hypertrophic breath work. Again, reincarnation come up again and again in these kind of stories of what people experience. And then Dr. Brian Weiss, Dr. Michael Newton, Rob Schwartz, and others. These are all very brave and courageous investigators who have uncovered past life memories and their importance in dealing with the issues of this life. So I think it's important that we all acknowledge there's a tremendous benefit to having this bigger view of who we are, where we came from, both from an individual sense and from the grander sense of humanity at large. And the lessons are very important, because the way this current world behaves is lost in the murky depths of materialist thought. Materialism was disproven in science more than 80 years ago with the advent of quantum physics. And yet many scientists, even quantum physicists, don't realize what a tremendous revolution around consciousness, the brain-mind connection, and all is unfolding all along these lines. And so it's important because the greed, the egocentrism, the kind of egomaniacal behavior, narcissists, of autocrats, sociopaths that bubble to the top in government systems and all that, corporate greed, the polarization of our economic systems, the violence, warfare, all of this is from the false teachings of materialism that we're separate objects, separate beings, and not acknowledging, as near-death experiencers do through that life review that has gone back thousands of years and in millions of cases, to show us that when you hurt another, you're hurting yourself. In the life review, if you've been handing out pain and suffering to others, you end up feeling that in the life review. And it's kind of almost neutral there. It's just that we don't like being mistreated. And so when you are being mistreated kind of by your own actions, as the other person influenced by those actions, as shown in your life review, you realize, well, I'm living my life the wrong way to subscribe to this materialist false teaching of separation. And I need a more quantum-informed, intelligent, modern kind of understanding of the brain-mind connection and the nature of consciousness to help me make proper decisions in how I lead this life.
I'm smiling. I'm smiling because I said that Indians, you don't have to convince about reincarnation. We were born believing in that reincarnation by Indians. And then Maya is one of the very important concepts in Hindu religion, and as growing up in India. So it is a very embedded in our thought process. It's a Western minds are out of trying to deal with the science and those kind of things that is the Western minds are struggling with. But I think in India, even the scientists are very much accepting the reincarnation and the concept of Maya is both of them illusion is very acceptable. You are absolutely right. The violence and everything is a purpose. Everything.
Well, it becomes very, very confusing if you think, for example, I grew up in a Christian household, and if you think that it's one incarnation and that's all there is to it, and then it's eternal, heaven or hell, that obviously makes no sense. And it takes more than one lifetime to get to this. And societies around the world have recognized through children reporting these, past lives, and then adults investigating those cases. Many cultures have known for thousands of years the reality of reincarnation. And for those who fight it in a conventional Christian tradition, I would remind them that, in discussions of King Herod and of Jesus of Nazareth, there's this obvious notion that John the Baptist was reincarnated from an earlier prophet. So the thinking of reincarnation was absolutely there at the time of Jesus of Nazareth, and yet it all got banned from modern, Christian teaching by Constantine. I'm not a religious scholar, so I'm not going to go into detail, but I think it was the Council of Nicaea where Constantine basically realized this talk of reincarnation, they needed to nip it in the bud, or their attempts to control people through this eternal heaven or hell after one incarnation wasn't going to work very well. And so Constantine was responsible for making any talk of reincarnation punishable by inverted crucifixion, which was the cruelest form of execution he knew of. That's how much anathema this idea of reincarnation was, because he knew that tithing and the priesthood and all that stuff that they were setting up wasn't going to demand the attention of people if they realized that they had their own kind of power through reincarnation, and leading future lives and being aware of that, and being able to take advantage of that, seeing that kind of truth in the system. Anyway, that's a whole theological argument. What I'm getting at is the modern study doesn't depend on any ancient religious scripture, even though I admit you're exactly right. In so many ways, the deep truths that modern quantum physics, neuroscience, philosophy of mind, parapsychology are all coming to realize is that we're all sharing one mind, and that we're all really bound together through the forces of love and kindness and compassion. And that there's not some deep battle between good and evil at the furthest, deepest, most sacrosanct levels of the spiritual realm, but that in fact, it is awash in love and the healing power of love that is so apparent. That's what near-death experiencers bring back. Even those who have a, quote, negative or hellish NDE, which is like 3 to 5% of all NDEs, they come back positively transformed. They come back realizing that at that level, it's the good that you've done. That's what speaks volumes in the evolution of this entire universe. And it's not as if what we see is a battle between good and evil in our material realm, in our earthly existence, doesn't exist in that deep spiritual realm. And I think that's really one of the more important points to make. And it's important for this world to wake up to this deep truth. Because if we keep hurting each other, ultimately, we're just damaging all of our spiritual progress and holding ourselves back. So it is time for all of this world to grow beyond our simplistic and false beliefs in materialism, its false sense of separation, and realize the deepest message about quantum physics, neuroscience, the brain-mind connection in the current era is really one acknowledging love, compassion, and kindness, and forgiveness is the main tools that we have to live our lives and to deal with all of our fellow beings.
Yes, Dr. Alexander, why medical education is reluctant to engage in the conversation about consciousness?
Well, I think it is changing very rapidly, actually. I know Larry Dossey, I presented with him several times. He's a wonderful physician who has written extensively about a lot of these topics over decades and is very knowledgeable about it all. In fact, I would say his book, One Mind, that came out, I think, in about 2012, is one of the most important books ever written about this notion of idealism and the primacy of mind. And certainly it influenced a lot of what we said in our book, Living in a Mindful Universe, although we took it several steps further too, because of course much progress was made over those years between when One Mind came out and Living in a Mindful Universe. But I think one thing that he points out is that programs in spirituality, you could find that in about 1 or 2 medical schools in the United States in the late 1990s. And now there are more than 40 such programs around the United States. So certainly in the US, you could say we were more backward, so we had to grow more. But at any rate, the reality is I think that there's been huge growth, even in the last 10 years since Proof of Heaven came out. For example, the number of scientific papers on NDEs has gone up fourfold since Proof of Heaven came out compared to the 32 years before that. That's if you do a National Library of Medicine search on NDEs, on near-death experiences. But I believe the medical profession is very rapidly, excuse me one second, very rapidly waking up on this entire topic. And especially, I would say, with the BigelowInstitute.org, with those scientific papers there in such huge volumes that all address this question of the afterlife, and in different ways and in very powerful ways that combine, because of the differences between them, into an irrefutable demonstration of the reality of the spiritual world and the afterlife. And this is just the way where the science is headed. And sooner or later, people so far have gotten by with being willfully ignorant. You still find the occasional person who comes on as a materialist, for example, to debate me about any of these topics, but they're getting harder and harder to find, because the more they start reading the literature, the more they realize that materialism is wrong and that their viewpoint is incorrect, and that materialism was disproven literally almost a century ago through quantum physics, but many in quantum physics even have not gotten to a point of being able to figure out just why the brain-mind connection and our mental experience compared to the physical world is such an important distinction that gets clarified as we start to examine more deeply quantum physics and the brain-mind connection and how all of this connects and works together. But this is really the way forward. And so the scientific community at large, and that certainly includes doctors and nurses who handle all these patients who have these kind of experiences, the more they wake up and share those experiences, the more this whole world will change. Because you come to realize that near-death and similar spiritually transformative experiences are actually quite common. And as people start to realize that, no, they haven't gone crazy, this thing that they never predicted or thought was possible that occurred when they left their physical body at the time of death, but then came back to, was absolutely real. And many other people have had the same experience. And that commonality of knowledge, that's one of the reasons I wrote Proof of Heaven, was to help to unify those who've had these experiences, to help share their story with the world. And these are the facts of human existence. It's not the rare occasional, Harvard neurosurgeon who has an NDE. These are extremely common. We know people in our town, in our neighborhood, who have had profound experiences of after-death communication, deathbed visions, phone calls or text messages from deceased loved ones, and dreams, very powerful and real dreams and phone calls in the middle of the night, that kind of thing. That shows the reality of it. But if you go to BigelowInstitute.org, start reading any of those papers, you'll realize that the answer is already in. We don't understand how it all works, but the factual reality of the afterlife, of the spiritual realm, and of our power of mind over matter is really there for us to discover.
My brother passed away last week with a similar situation like yours. And then I feel that I have a deep spiritual connection with him in that sense. I wanted to ask you, why don't why don't they use consciousness as a part of the treatment process?
Well, and this is something we discussed quite a bit in Living in a Mindful Universe, but it really has to do with kind of placebo effect, the power of prayer, and healing, distance healing, energy healing, Reiki, things like that, that have some proven basis in reality in terms of their efficacy. And I think that it's just a question of time. We need to do the studies, and that needs to get out into the literature in bigger and bigger ways. From my point of view, the power of prayer is already very well demonstrated, and I would recommend the books of Larry Dossey, again, especially his book Healing Words, and his another book that's called Be Careful What You Pray For. And of course, that should advise you just from the title that prayer has quite a bit of power, often more power than we think. So do be careful what you pray for, because often it can come to fruition. And the universe can be quite literal in how it interprets what we're asking for and what we're wanting. But I think that that's really the other resource would be Robert Koenig, Koenig. He was from Duke, and he wrote The Healing Power of Faith. I believe that was the title of the book. But they're very, very good demonstrations of how mental experience, going within, centering prayer, meditation, what have you, can be very powerful. And that's one of the reasons why Karen and I went into such detail about that in our book, Living in a Mindful Universe. And we do it so much in our coursework, too. And you can learn more about those courses at ebenalexander.com and also at sacredacoustics.com. But we basically take the approach that sentient beings, any of us who are conscious, has the ability to start to influence their own health and healing and start probing into and developing a relationship with this kind of neutral observer, this kind of God force of total love and knowing at the core of the universe, through a regular practice of meditation. And the most obvious statement to make about that is that the little voice in our head, that running stream of thoughts in my head, is not Eben Alexander. And so many people make the mistake of thinking that they are identical with that running stream of thoughts in their head. I love how Michael Singer puts it in his book, The Untethered Soul. He calls that running stream of thoughts in your head your annoying roommate. And that says it all, because that little voice, and of course, that's the voice of rational discussion and logic, and every bit of that is our linguistic brain, but in many ways it can be misleading. And it's not always the pathway to truth. I love how Albert Einstein would drift around in a sailboat looking up at the sky, daydreaming for hours on end before he'd come up with some of his greatest ideas. Thomas Alva Edison would hold some weights in his hands when he was really sleepy. He'd get into these hypnagogic states a few times with these micro naps, and weights would drop and it wakes him up. And that's where some of his greatest ideas came from. Robert Louis Stevenson had a similar idea for coming up with the ideas from his poetry, his novels, his music. Salvador Dali, others, all these creative minds in philosophy and science and art and music, they've realized you don't use that little follow the breadcrumbs of your rational, logical mind to always get to the truth. Some of the deepest truths in the scientific world have come from these kind of, letting oneself go, that daydreaming, hypnagogic space. But I would argue that through meditation, we can develop a much more facile relationship with that, the universe at large, with that knowledge base of the universe at large. And so for me, I've used sacred acoustics meditations pretty much daily for more than 10 years now to return to my NDE, not just to recover memories of it, but to develop and enrich and enliven the relationships I have with the various guides and mentors that I first encountered in the NDE. And a lot of that story, personal story, is told in my third book, Living in a Mindful Universe. It goes way beyond Proof of Heaven to talk about how I use meditation to return to that NDE and how that's empowered me in a lot of the healing that I've been able to muster, since my near-death experience itself.
Talking about acoustics, Rajita Pamakanti, registered nurse from Emory, my co-host right now, he has a question.
Thank you. It's an honor to be here talking to you, Dr. Alexander. So other than being a nurse, I'm also a holistic health coach. And so I wanted to ask you, do we have to be at that near-death experience to inculcate healing in our body? Can we heal? Are we resilient to be able to heal? Do we have
Yes.
the power?
I would say we have tremendous power to heal ourselves. And again, our discussion there covers not just placebo effect, which we've honored for more than 6 decades as a gold standard for any new treatment we want to investigate. But the placebo effect is nothing more than admission by medical science that beliefs, thoughts, and attitudes have a tremendous role in healing. And then go beyond that to spontaneous remission. If you go to noetic.org, put in the search term spontaneous remission, you'll find a book they published in the mid-1990s with more than 3,500 cases of people who healed advanced cancer, advanced infection, even healed some congenital deformities they were born with, things like that, through the power of mind over matter. And then, of course, the miraculous healing in NDEs, like my case, Anita Morjani, Mary C. Neal. These are all cases where the healing is completely unprecedented in the medical literature. And all of them are examples of how we can heal ourselves. We can come into more full healing. It doesn't take a near-death experience to do this. This is something Karen and I have promoted in our workshops around the world for several years now, helping people get into healing in their own way to realize the power that mind can have over matter in terms of bringing healing to our lives. The sacred acoustics connection, just very briefly, has to do with a phenomenon first discovered called binaural beats. It was discovered in the mid-1800s by a Prussian physicist who found that a pure tone in one ear, a slightly different pure tone in the other ear, and somewhere deep in the brain, you generate this wavering signal that's equal to the arithmetic difference between the two input signals. So 104 hertz, 100 hertz here would give me a 4 hertz signal deep in the brain. And that was discovered 200 years ago. And then in the late 20th century, people found that such binaural beats could enable enhanced out-of-body experiences and remote viewing experiences, two ways of getting out of the here and now of the physical body and discerning information across time and space. And then I would say in our book, in Living in a Mindful Universe, we discuss a lot more what we think is going on there, why it works so well, but it's mainly that it's affecting a circuit that arose in the lower brainstem more than 300 million years ago, before mammals walked this earth. So if you've ever heard a chant or anthem or hymn that might have engendered some deep transcendental state of conscious awareness, those are all processed up in the acoustic cortex of the temporal lobes, circuits that have evolved in human beings and Homo sapiens primates over the last 2, 3, 4 million years. Very different from these ancient circuits in the lower brainstem. That's where sacred acoustics is targeting, just as are any other forms of binaural beat brainwave entrainment. I think if you try the sacred acoustics, you'll see why I prefer it as my mode of going deep within, and it's very effective at allowing me to separate my conscious awareness from here, now, and a sense of self. And that is the first stage to really get to developing that relationship with that primordial mind, that God force across the veil. And that's where the healing really starts to come into power.
Thank you. So is that sacred acoustic? By listening to that, do we get into the deeper meditative state, getting out of this constant thoughts that are going on?
Yes, and in fact, on her website, on sacredacoustics.com, Karen Newell has put a number of pages that are very instructive, very short, free videos to give clues about going very deep, and the many different goals that people come with. I mean, people come to this field of meditation with everything under the sun as a possible goal, something they want to attain. And on her website, you will find there's a lot of very direct pathways to help people to follow a specific goal through a certain specific prescribed set of sacred acoustics audio files. There are more than 20 kind of master files available there. I use a lot of them on a pretty regular basis, but she's got a very good go-to page on sacredacoustics.com to help people to learn more about the techniques. Basically, I would say all you're really doing is learning to let that little ego voice in your head make a statement of intention or request, but then it goes into timeout, and then you're just writing those musical tones. And before long, I'm so deeply into it that I don't even hear the tones anymore. So just learning to ride that rhythm and focus on the breath does a tremendous amount to allow one to be set free from the here now and the sense of self.
There are the LSD. Some people are claiming that auditory and visual stimulations are causing is lowering the depression and other things. Can we simulate the experience of the LSD experience through technology by creating visual and auditory simulations.
Yeah, well, it's very important not to get sucked into the rabbit hole of materialism and promissory materialism in particular. On the one hand, they try and say that it's all just hallucinations, chemical noise giving you these illusions of things happening. And then they try to claim, that it explains these spiritual experiences. And I think they're really missing the point all around. First of all, important to point out that there have been at least 4 or 5 papers in the last 9 years that have used functional MRI, magnetoencephalography, other very precise techniques at looking at neuronal population activity in the brain under the influence of things like psilocybin, magic mushrooms, LSD, DMT, dimethyltryptamine, active principle, and ayahuasca. And uniformly, what these studies show is the brain is going dark. So if you're looking for a materialist explanation, like, oh boy, I just took some psilocybin, my brain must be lighting up like a Christmas tree to be witnessing what I'm seeing here, the truth of the matter is no, your brain is actually going dark and getting out of the way. If you're looking for answers, you must look beyond the brain and beyond materialist science to get those answers. The other important thing I would state about psychedelic research in the current era is that there are several papers recently that have looked at the use of psilocybin, magic mushrooms again, in the treatment of severe addictions. So some of the worst addictions known: nicotine, opioids, alcohol, and also it's been used in debilitating fear of death in terminal cancer patients. And in both cases, 1 or 2 doses of psilocybin in a proper therapeutic setting can give you months or years of complete clearance of those addictions or of that fear of death. And I would argue it's not like you're having to take it like a regular medication. And that's because I believe all it's doing is thinning the veil, which I would argue you can do equally well using meditation. And that thinning of the veil allows you to connect to that higher soul, and that's where that healing comes from. That's why, for example, Bill Wilson, who was one of the founders of Alcoholics Anonymous, he tried LSD towards the end of his life to see how that might influence his healing. And he was kind of impressed with the potential there. But I would say that these modern studies go a lot further in showing that this, once or twice thinning of the veil to allow us to connect to higher soul. And I would argue you don't need the substance ultimately to do that. And that's what we're working on, is the meditative protocols to replace those substances for what I would believe will be a far more effective and safer way of accomplishing these beautiful goals. Even though those methods are very safe as it is, there really are no significant side effects or problems with those drugs in the proper therapeutic setting. But these 2 comments about psychedelics, I hope make the point that, for one thing, it's not just hallucinations and chemical noise in the brain, but we're actually being shown something about the spiritual realm that's very important for us to know and understand. And that is where tremendous healing potential lies. That's why learning to meditate, go within, start to realize how much power your higher soul has when you come at this viewing the love the universe has for you and sharing that love with others. Kindness, compassion, mercy, taking care of the least, the last, and the lost. This is our job as human beings, as sentient beings coming into this awareness, is to find that healing is through service to others, helping others. We bring healing to this world by bringing healing to ourselves, and that is ultimately done through expressions of unconditional love, compassion, kindness, acceptance, and when necessary, forgiveness.
Dr. Alexander, I'm promoting this new idea, that is, we simulate the experience of that DMT experience or ayahuasca experience with the technology by creating a simulated auditory and visual stimulations, and I think it can help without those substances involved. What do you think of that?
I think we run into trouble where, it's just a question of whether you're calling things hallucinations, are they really there? Are they not there? And all that the language gets us into so much trouble around all
Correct.
this. And for me, it's much better just to take a kind of a bigger holistic view of this notion of one mind, of the brain as filter, and then see that there is a will of the universe. And that often humans can express free will, for example, in moving and things like that. And in neuroscience, they would call into question any notion that you have of free will because they think it's all just chemical reactions, electron fluxes in the brain. My NDE showed me that that was completely wrong and that we need the bigger view, the spiritual view, the soul view, the relationship view that really looks at all of this as having a purpose. But the purpose is something that we find through our being as human beings existing in these bodies and interacting with our fellow souls in this process of mutual learning and teaching to grow and to learn. But I think we really have to talk in those bigger terms, and I think it can be quite confusing if right at the get-go you're talking about those auditory and visual things as just being hallucinations, which really just means not real in any sense. And I think there the language kind of gets us into trouble.
Sorry, I got disconnected over there. So I wanted to ask you, what would you say to those people, I have medications to help me. A physician knows to write a prescription to give it to me. I don't need all this spirituality. So how would you answer to somebody?
Well, if somebody's perfectly happy with their life and feel like they're healthy as can be, and they don't mind any of the interventions that they're doing, then fine, more power to you. But I mean, where I've been, none of that helped. I was very far gone from this world. My doctors basically gave up on me after 7 days in coma, that there was no way I was going to come back. Now, I don't look at my survival as a miracle. I look at my survival as a 2% probability. That's not a miracle. But my recovery really has to be, it goes beyond anything reported in the medical literature. You don't get that sick. If you read that medical case report in Journal of Nervous and Mental Diseases, September 2018 by Dr. Serbi Khanna, Lauren Moore, and Dr. Bruce Grayson, you realize you don't get that sick from meningoencephalitis involving all lobes of the brain and then end up having a full recovery. It just doesn't happen without something else very big going on. The very big is what I'm talking about. So I'm talking about healing when we're faced with situations where our modern medicine really isn't up to snuff. That's not to say that it can't be very effective at healing in all manner and all level of diseases. And in fact, I would say from my point of view, you really start to wonder how much the substance, how much the actual medicine, the chemical that we're taking from Big Pharma, how much it actually has to do with the healing. Because a tremendous amount of it is due to our belief that my doctor gave me this and he told me this would heal me. And we tend to follow our beliefs, and our beliefs can be incredibly powerful at opening up certain aspects of the universe, sometimes very surprising aspects of the universe. But that's why it's so good to get into kind of exploring this. And that's why I love daily meditations, no matter what my goal is for a given day. It's just getting to know that mental space, that mental universe, the kind of broader aspects of self much more broadly. I find to be tremendously informative and valuable in really all aspects of my life. So it's just well worth doing.
Dr. Alexander, you talk about your son, Bond, all the time. It's in the book a few times and in your talks. And he was studying in neuroscience when he was doing that, right?
Well, you're mixing my two sons up. My younger son, Bond, was 10 years old at the time. He was the one I saw at the very end of my coma and came back to this world. Even though I didn't recognize him, I didn't understand the words he was saying, but I sensed this deep connection, even though my body was just about dead at that point. And then it was my older son, Eben IV, who was 20 years old at the time, and he was the one majoring in neuroscience. He's the one who told me, write everything down before you read anything about anybody else's near-death experience. That was the best advice I've ever gotten. I wanted to read everything I could, but he convinced me I better write it all down first. He knew that every time you visit a memory, you change it, or you risk changing it. And so I needed that database that was just pure and simple, my experience, untainted by anyone else's report. And that's why I'm so glad I wrote that original 20,000 words, which is really the basis of the book Proof of Heaven.
My son is Ramesh, is a neuroscience graduate from Vanderbilt, actually, like your son.
Very good.
Thank you. But
Dr. Alexander, your spiritual treasure for America, not only for America, is you opened up several minds with with the impeccable credentials you have, with your compelling story that you opened up the people with educational backgrounds and varied educational backgrounds from around the world. We are blessed to have you among us. Thank you, sir.